You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
The greatest problem of all is death, the final cessation of all our hopes and dreams, our successes and failures, our loves, hates, worries, and plans. Socrates said, "Death is either a dreamless sleep, which is great because he could use the rest, or a passage to another life, which is also great because you can hang out with cool people who have already died. Therefore, either way, you have nothing to fear." Buddhist teachings emphasize the impermanence of existence. Quote, "Rather than being born and dying, our true nature is that of no birth and no death." Bodhidharma said, "One clings to life, although there is nothing to be called life. Another clings to death, although there is nothing to be called death. In reality, there is nothing to be born. Consequently, there is nothing to perish." Epicurus argued death is the cessation of sensation. Good and evil only make sense in terms of sensation. So death is neither good nor evil. So make the sensations of being alive as great as possible, and don't worry about when those sensations are going to stop. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, said, quote, "Life is going forth, death is returning home, and life and death are one thread, the same line viewed from different sides." Viktor Frankl said, quote, "It is not us who should ask for a meaning of life. It is us being asked in the first place." Aldous Huxley said, quote, "It's a bit embarrassing to have been concerned with the human problem all one's life and find at the end that one has nothing more to offer by way of advice than be a little kinder." Albert Camus said, quote, "There is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Deciding whether or not life is worth living is to answer the fundamental question in philosophy. All other questions follow from that." For Camus, life is meaningless, and no meaning can be placed upon it. But that doesn't mean life can't be sensuous and enjoyable, because we can choose how to respond to that meaninglessness. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And Alan Watts said, quote, "If the universe is meaningless, so is the statement that it is so. The meaning and purpose of dancing is the dance." As you may have guessed, on this episode of Cemetery Confessions, we're going to be talking about death. And as the agglomeration of quotes I've just read demonstrate, understanding, coming to terms with, and finding meaning in the face of death has been the focus of thought and philosophy since humans have been able to think and philosophize. There's comfort to be taken in that. Our guest this episode is Mandy Benwalid, the founder of Keeper, which is an online memorial platform that we'll be talking about, as well as the co-founder and editor of TalkDeath, which is a website and YouTube channel that shares content, interviews, articles, think pieces around death positive culture and the social, environmental, cultural, and political impact that death has on the world. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the relevance of technology and the ubiquity of technology and the interconnectedness of today's society, how that plays into death and dying. We'll be talking about death anxiety and how to avoid nihilism, how to prepare for the end of life, and sharing anecdotes around our experiences with death and talking about death. After the interview, we have Azzy of Obscura Undead returning with their segment All Goth Considered to hear from 3 new bands and their new singles. We also have Sinister Suggestions returning, so I'll be talking about new releases out in the last month as well. As always, I am your host, Danny Ashes. I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Mandy, let's get into the episode by learning a little about you, because this is a goth podcast. And also, I think this is kind of a fun question when we have guests on from outside of the scene. But I would like to ask if you have any history with any sort of alternative culture, and if that had informed your views on death at any point in your life.
Yeah, actually, I was definitely an emo kid as a young teen. I think I was maybe 12 or 13, and I started listening to kind of like your classic emo, hardcore, and screamo.
Mm-hmm.
As an example, like I was pretty obsessed with Thursday and Poison the Well and
Oh,
Converge and all that wonderful stuff. So
Yeah.
I guess to answer your question, yes. And then I eventually sort of, when I was maybe 16, had more of a classic punk phase, was listening to a lot more like New York City, like 80s, like Johnny Thunders and Richard Hell. And I just became really obsessed with music, and I started playing music and playing in bands. And then I eventually moved on to more metal as I got older, doom metal, black metal, that whole world.
Fantastic.
All right.
Yeah, so probably stuff we could talk about there. And most people don't realize that when they see me, because I'm typically more like in my corporate mode with Keeper. And it's mostly my friends that know that the work I do in death care is, I guess, fitting for me. You know, it's something that I didn't really think about if it has kind of informed my views on death at all, but I have to say it must have. And I think part of it is that there's a lot of imagery within, you know, emo, metal, punk, hardcore that was very much associated with death.
Mhm.
And, you know, always wearing black and skulls and all that wonderful stuff that I still wear today. And, you know, I was obsessed with Nightmare Before Christmas, like every classic emo
Of
kid
course.
was.
Excellent.
Shopped at Hot Topic,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
And so, like, it's one of those things where I think maybe it lent itself, like that kind of almost like glamorizing that imagery kind of maybe lent itself to like give me a bit more familiarity with it.
It certainly encompassed you in at least a subculture or a group that was a little more positive around the concepts of death, or would talk about it bluntly rather than talking around it like our overall culture tends to do.
One of the first closest losses I had was my grandfather. And when I showed up with purple hair and like a mohawk, he probably didn't like it, but he was never someone that like judged me for it. And he always kind of made fun of me, but like in a very kind of sweet, loving way. And when he was sick in the hospital, I was going to take care of him. And I didn't necessarily need to. My grandmother was luckily alive and was able to do that. But I kind of just felt myself drawn to being there with him and caring for him. And then when he died, I was visiting the cemetery like a few times a week after school. I would just bike over there after school and just sit by his grave and just like have my afternoon snack. And I actually even, funny enough, like had friends that were working at that cemetery the summer he died.
Wow.
And we would just go into the cemetery like late at night. And I had a lot of grief because I think he was a really important person in my life, but also because it was my first loss. And I just felt so comfortable being at the cemetery. And I have to wonder, is part of it because of how I've been involved in that imagery in so many other ways. But I just always kind of felt okay with death in the sense that it was something I leaned into as opposed to trying to avoid it.
Right. That does make sense. And, because sometimes I wonder how death is used in alternative subcultures, if it is sometimes more utilized as a patina or a defense or a romanticization where
or simply a reason or a way to poke your fingers at people who are uncomfortable about it, about a way to get a rise out of people sometimes.
I think it's all of the above for sure. We do it in a way to sort of be different, and that's what a lot of subcultures are. But I think that the romanticization of it was definitely there, and it was definitely present in the lyrics and in album art.
Mm-hmm.
You did bring something up that brought another question to my mind, where when I've had interactions with people around death, they aren't generally surprised that I am interested in death, or I guess more generally informed on the topic, because when you look at me visually, I have my head is shaved, I have tattoos and piercings, I'm usually dressed as a goth. But I wonder, at least when you're in professional mode and meeting people, if you've had some odd or negative reactions when they find out about your profession or your interests.
Oh, definitely. I've definitely had people give me strange and confused looks. And funny enough, most of my professional sort of life is within the death care space. So
Okay.
when I say my professional world is, I'm going to funeral conferences, I'm going to cemetery conferences. But this is what's funny is that I was at a conference for cemeteries just last week in New York. And I was sitting at a table with a bunch of people that run and own cemeteries. And something that I do in my volunteer time is I'm part of my local Hevra Kadisha, which is a group of people that take care that wash and casket a body after someone dies in the Jewish tradition. It's called Hevra Kadisha translates into the Holy Society. So that's what I do is sort of in my volunteer time is I dress and casket bodies, and the amount of looks of like, oh my God, you bathe a dead body, like you're around corpses, and I'm like, you work at a cemetery, and people were looking at me like so weird, and so
but they're already boxed away there.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. You're totally right. But yeah, so even in that world, people are like surprised that I'm not just doing the tech side of it, that I'm actually doing the work.
Right. Well, so let's talk about that. Let's get some of that background. What was your journey into the death space like? How did that come about? And then how did the work with TalkDeath and Keeper kind of come about?
Yeah, so the idea with Keeper was really just one of those aha moments, I guess you could say. And it started when I was at a cemetery visiting my step grandparents. Actually, they were in more of a like Catholic style cemetery, and there was a columbarium with a glass front niche. So basically, what that is for folks that aren't aware, it's um, generally in like a mausoleum style space where it's little glass kind of boxes where you're able to place an urn. And because it's glass, you can see through it. So people will often put like memorabilia, like photographs and different pieces that represent that person along with their urn. And so I was walking through this building and I saw a blank CD. So, one of those CDs we would burn in the 90s. and it just had the words Dad's work written on it in Sharpie. And it was a really weird thing to see. This was over like 12 years ago that I saw this.
Mm.
And it was really one of those moments where I was like, that's, first of all, that's super weird. Seeing that, seeing that piece of technology like that in a cemetery space. We're so used to just having your classic monument marble.
Right.
It really, from there, I was just so curious what was in there. I tried Googling his name, nothing came up. And it just gave me the thought that, what if we could learn about every single person in a cemetery? What if you could just walk through a cemetery and just look up someone's name and like find the story behind them and just like see a photo of them? And so that's really how the idea with Keeper started. And I was privileged enough to be able to work with some developers and kind of bootstrap this as a website. So Keeper is an online memorial platform. And the idea is that people go online, they make a page for someone that's passed away, and then family and friends contribute photographs and stories, and it's a family tree. And then we link it to an actual physical location. So if they had a marker in a cemetery, if they're scattered, basically you can like mark where their final resting place is.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually back in the day did QR codes. So we would sell QR codes that you put on a monument so that you can just scan it and go to that person's memorial page right away.
Okay.
Funny enough, we stopped selling those because QR codes weren't very popular. And then now we're post-COVID and everyone's asking us where our QR codes are for monuments, which is kind of funny. Yeah, and so I had, nothing to do in the deathcore world at all. And so I kind of just built that as an idea. I'm not really a business person. I was supposed to work in like documentary filmmaking. That was supposed to be my path. And I was just like, you know what, I'm going to give this thing a try. And from there, we started writing a blog, like strictly really for marketing purposes, to be honest, for SEO, for people to find our website more.
Right, yeah.
And then as I started writing about the subject of death and learning about it and understanding more about the problems with the funeral industry and understanding more about grief and so many subjects around it and the way other cultures handle their deceased, I just became really fascinated by it. And we actually became known more for our like blog writing content as opposed to like our online memorials. And because I just became so kind of enthralled in that world, I started writing about it so much. And then TalkDeath came about because we decided, you know what, like Keeper and like what we were writing on Keeper's blog versus what we're trying to build as like a platform are quite separate in a way. So we basically rebranded. TalkDeath became its own beast, its own brand. And now they're just sister companies and we just run them together, basically.
Mm-hmm. I genuinely love the idea of Keeper. I actually have, because I have ADHD, I keep lists of things to do. And that's one of my to-do things is to make an account and get that set up. I wanted to ask how, because I have some thoughts on this, but if you think, or some ways that you see Keeper can provide, or TalkDeath even, insights into our own lives and our own mortality by encouraging that reflection on our own death by going through that process and setting that up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just as a start, like anytime you're engaging or contemplating with the subject of death, whether it's, the loss of a loved one, or even maybe the impending loss of someone who has an illness, just that is a way for us to kind of start reflecting and talking about death. But something that we actually do at Keeper as well that you might be interested in is we have something called living memorials. And what that is essentially a memorial page, but for someone who hasn't passed away yet. So the idea is that you go on, you create a page for yourself, and you start preserving your own favorite memories. You start writing your own obituary or your biography. You put in all the important milestones in your life. And essentially, you're doing that to be remembered in your own words.
Mm-hmm.
And then the reason behind the name Keeper is that you would assign someone to be your keeper of your page so that when you pass away, they're the ones that will publish it, help maintain it. And so we are, it's not as popular. There was a moment where it got popular during COVID, and funny enough, TMZ like did an article about us where people are so scared of COVID that they're writing their own obituaries. They totally sensationalized it, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that is a way that we are trying to have people take that time to reflect on their own life, kind of think about the impermanence of their life, and think about also how they want to be remembered. What stands out of the noise, right? I know we're posting on social media constantly. What are the important things that you're writing about or that you're sharing, and what do you want people to be remembering you by?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly what I was intending on setting up, because I like that idea. And it's something I want to talk about, or we can talk about a little bit later, is that meditation on death and sort of refocusing on what's important in our lives and using technology as a tool for that. And I like the idea of the service as a way of humanizing death and kind of moving, because I know I've struggled with this, and I know friends of mine have struggled with seeing death as something that happens to other people. And I think society plays into that idea as well. I know I spoke with my dad recently, actually, who's in his late 70s, and he opened up about his death anxiety to me, because we've had a lot of deaths in our extended family recently. And he talked about how dying is something he only recently started worrying about. So I talked to him briefly about my own struggle the last couple years with around existential dread and going on a journey to try and better accept my own inevitable death. But he was of the mind that I should ignore the reality of death in order to better enjoy my life right now and leave that concern for the future. So he told me, not to think about those things because he didn't want me to have to worry about it for another 30 years or so. Whereas I would take the mindset of dealing with this now and making it a continual practice with some sort of ritualistic, mindful element to alleviate that death anxiety when it does come time to die. Not to mention that I've had friends who have died younger than I am right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a guarantee that, I won't have to confront that reality anytime, soon. And that I think there's a saying about that, about how lifelong meditation is important, because meditation is essentially the practice of accepting death. And so that we should deal with death now so as to have a more peaceful transition out of life. And I think for me, out of that interaction, the more interesting part for me was that my dad is a very devoutly religious person and has a very strong faith in the afterlife. But his confidence in that didn't at least entirely remove his anxiety around death, which is interesting, I think, and maybe points to the fact that death is more about a transition. So to some degree, we have to become more comfortable with ephemerality and impermanence rather than just what comes after death, which, maybe belief systems like Buddhism or Taoism try to build frameworks and practices around seeing life as constant change and constant becoming and that kind of thing. But I think that was more interesting to me. And so coming back to Keeper and the sort of living memorial and sort of like you were saying, making a annual sort of taking stock of what are the important things in my life. And I guess making death accessible and relatable through a social media platform, through technology, which is really kind of the primary way we engage semiotically with the world and build our identities. That, I think, is a great tool to break down those cultural barriers that my dad has dealt with and kept him from engaging with, and a lot of people from engaging with, that a fuller understanding of our own deaths.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I feel like you're right on point when you mention the whole mindfulness and meditation piece. I do not consider myself a spiritual person, and the whole like mindfulness thing, I like have been totally in denial that I should be doing it, but I know it's super important, and my therapist tells me every day, well, every week. But I think that it's really interesting because you being, obviously at a younger age than your father, starting to think about this now, starting to think about, okay, what's important in my life? How do I want to be remembered? And thinking about death a little more closely in that way, imagine what if your father was your age and he started thinking of that at that time? Do you think his relationship with his aging and with him becoming closer to death, would that be different now? Imagine you think about it at least once a year. You actively reflect on the fact that you're going to die and that your life is not permanent. I think that that can have a huge effect on someone in a positive way and on their life in a positive way. And this is, so cliche, but we thinking about death, talking about death is just a way to be remembering and thinking about life and the kind of life you want to live. And just that simple act, which, to some can be morbid, but I think it's beautiful, it's celebratory when you're taking the
Yeah.
time to write about yourself and think about everything you've left behind. Because what I love about that process is that when you're in that moment, even if you do it, like you said, like once a year, what are you pulling out as the important things, right? I feel like we're so in this intense hustle of everyday life that
Yeah.
we don't sit back and we're like, what is important to me? I still don't really know what's totally important to me. The only thing I really think of still when I, again, talk about this in therapy is like, okay, I really like nature and I really love my dog.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Hmm.
what is it that like makes us keep going? What is it that really brings us joy? And for me, like my fear around death is more like I just hope that I can get to that point where I know I can just be like happy in my life because I have existential crises every day. Like, why am I working when I know I'm
Mm,
going to be dying? Like, why am I
hmm.
doing X because I'm going to die? But then by thinking about that and by thinking about your life, you're able to say, okay, well, these are the things that I'm pulling out and I'm trying that I want to share. I want people to know about when I die. So then that kind of helps you formulate a way to, what you should keep on living for.
Right.
Yeah.
Any Trey, any thoughts on that before I want to get more into the death anxiety bit a little bit later. I wanted to ask a question about technology. I don't know if you had anything to throw in, Trey, before we
Sure.
move on.
I mean, one thing I think we were kind of talking around and we sort of touched on a couple of times is I think that one of the things that is important to think about in life is one's own legacy, what one is leaving behind, what one is. That's kind of what we're doing with our life, right? Because our life ends, but we persist on in how we've affected the world. And for some people, that's good works. For some people, it's family. For some people, it's creating art or things like that. And I think it's just important to, at least to me, to kind of get over that existential dread is to concentrate on the how am I living my life in the now that is leading towards a better world or a legacy for myself to be remembered fondly and to live on after death in the minds of those who I've left behind, in a way that I would be proud of. And that just makes me feel a lot better about what I'm doing now, allows me to focus on the now without worrying so much about, oh, but I'm just going to die. And what does it matter? Well, it matters to me because it's what I leave behind. All my acts is what I'm going to leave behind. And that's really very important to me.
Well, let's go there then. What about you, Mandy? What are your thoughts on legacy? And I do think that varies from person to person and culture to culture, but how do you find meaning in, or how do you, I'll just more broadly, how do you find, how do you think about your own legacy?
It's a good question, and it's something that I don't think I have an answer for yet. And I feel like it's something that I'm still trying to learn and to understand. Because, I when I talk sometimes, I was just chatting with my partner before this, and I was wondering, like, do I actually care if I'm remembered after I die?
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if I
Hmm.
actually care.
Yeah.
But then, he was like, well, look at all the work you're doing, like the podcasts you're on, and the people that are even, slightly being touched, or the fact that you being influenced in any way by something that you say or that you do, and the work that I'm putting in. Because, like, I work really hard, and, like, that's why sometimes I'm still like, why am I doing this? So, I don't know if I have a solid answer for that, because part of me is also like, with death acceptance, does it have to be about, like, it almost feels like an ego thing too, right? Like, we can't accept, like full ego
Right.
death. Like, we can't, like,
Yeah.
it is totally connected to ego death.
Yeah.
And do I need to be remembered, right? Why can't I just be satisfied with living a wonderful life and hopefully touching people? And, what it brings up for me is, I did one of my first papers in something we called Cégep in Quebec. It's like a pre-university, so I was maybe 16, 17. And I did a philosophy class, and I wrote a philosophy paper on the meaning of life. So I read a bunch of
Oh,
philosophers, don't
easy.
ask me which ones, of what's the meaning of life. And it is a question that it is an answer, the conclusion of that paper, that still sticks with me. And this is, I guess, a way to answer this question is, you can say that you've lived a good life, or that your life has had meaning, if someone else can say that your presence in their life has made a difference or has impacted them positively in some way.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I feel good, that's where, for me, it's not that, okay, I want to be remembered. It's that I want to know that I went through my life and I did something else for people to make their lives a little
Yeah.
better.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You want to have an impact, whether it's attributed to you as immaterial. It's an impact on the world that left things better, let people better, things like that.
Yeah, that's what I hope for sure.
Yeah. I think I agree. The way I come at it is, I think every action matters. So, like, a lot of people, kind of like what you were alluding to, Trey, is the more grand, leaving my name behind, something that will last a long time after my death. For me, I think that I'm more on Mandy's sort of train here, where, not that you were advocating for something different, Trey, but, like, the way I come at it is, the I think the small moments radiate out into the world and make those small moments bigger than just what they seem to be on their own. Because
Mhm.
those interactions, I think, at least, those interactions create the present moment. So the moment now exists because our action and interaction in the world creates the present moment. And so it could have happened, right now, could have happened a million other ways, but it's happening this way because this moment is connected to every other moment, and it makes up this web of our experienced reality. So for me, that makes each small action quite grand. And that means that I've left this mark on the world without the need for any kind of earth shattering act or project that lasts with my name on it in any recognizable way. And personally, I really don't think we're guaranteed, no matter how hard we try, a future where our name lasts into the future anyway. I think
Oh,
that
no.
the internet is just as ephemeral as we are. I think if even if you're talking about, like, your grave site, I don't think that's guaranteed to stay in the same spot for the next 100 years or whatever. There's a million things that could happen with that. So for me, I very much what you were saying, Mandy. I think about what am I doing right now to make the world better for what's around me. what impact am I making in this moment right now?
And even if it's
So
just helping one person or one
right.
being, right? And it's like it almost reminds me of when I first like went vegan, like I don't know, like 17 years ago, and like the one argument that people would always say, they're like, but you're one person, like you're not going to make a difference. Like it doesn't matter if you don't eat meat, like the rest of the world is doing it. And it just reminds me so much of that like just because you're one person doesn't mean you can't make an impact. And now, like, look at the sort of vegetarian movement that's kind of exploding, and it saves like a lot of animals from being like slaughtered.
Mhm.
And that's something that I don't really know why was so important to me, why I did it when I was so young. But it's something that has stuck with me, and it's like I that's part of like what I want to leave, is that like I didn't add more harm.
Right. And I
Yeah,
mean,
and every
7 years
every
is also that creates something over time as well.
yeah, and every huge movement that has made great change has been a mass of one persons who made that decision on their own. They didn't collectively all join together and make the decision at the same time. Everybody was make it for themselves. And making that just the various statement saying that, oh, well, you're just one person is basically, it's almost a defense mechanism by the person who's saying it, saying, I'm trying to excuse myself because I don't want to make this inconvenient change in my life. So I want to justify that by being, well, it doesn't matter if I do it. So they have to put that on other people too, because that's the only way they can preserve their own ability to make those decisions.
Yeah,
By
and
believing
it's
that.
like avoiding it too, right? And like
Mhm.
it reminds me right again of, why people are not planning for their death, and they're not planning their own funeral and what they want to happen to them. It's like, well, I'm going to be dead, so it doesn't matter. And it's this constant, it doesn't matter, that just leads people to not take any action and to not take any change.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, and I mean, that's what the sort of the idea of small actions radiating out is part of for me, a broader philosophy where, of course, it matters because every action is connected to everyone else. So if our society and our world is contingent and our communities are co-constructed through not just like material objects, but agents like people and organisms, everything we do requires uh, action from agents and the environment around us, and it's all interconnected. It's interrelational. So the anything you do will have an impact, even if you don't see it necessarily initially, and even if you don't see how it impacts something down the line. It's all inextricably linked. So for legacy reasons, like even if I'm forgotten, I can know at least that the world has changed because I existed. Um, and actually, that's why I like, in a lot of ways, the I think it's called the Recomposition Project, where they let you, which I think that's in Washington, but that
Yeah.
where they let you turn your body essentially into compost, and then
Mhm.
if you decide to, they can mix those remains into the remains of other people, and then that's spread out across a forest, and you can't distinguish whose dirt is whose, but it persists and it creates demonstrable environmental changes, and so your legacy continues on in that way, which is kind of this great representation for that sort of philosophical ontological web that I think makes up the world, where it is this interconnected web of action. So, I don't care. It would be cool if in 30 years people were like, oh, hey, I found this podcast called Cemetery Confessions, and it was like this weird artifact of the goth scene that somebody dug up. But I don't really need that, because for me, I know that by existing and actively deciding to make change in the world is therefore different and hopefully a better place because I was in it. And so if I build my philosophy and my perspective and worldview around that, then that can be enough for me.
Very well said. I totally agree.
Well, let me go back to technology then, because I did want to. I want to talk a little bit more about some existential things, but I do want to ask a few questions around the technology of death, and some areas that I have not a lot of experience with. When we're looking at ways of engaging with death using modern technology, there was one example I remembered from a few years ago where Zoomer was taking a selfie with their dead grandparent, and there was a bunch of articles about that. But obviously, we talking about functioning in the world, technology facilitates the way we interact with the world and also facilitates the way we interact and engage with death, right? We were talking about Keeper just a moment ago. So when it comes to our phones and our apps and our cameras and things like that, do you think that technology has facilitated healthy engagements with death in some ways, or is it just perpetuating kind of the death avoidant culture that we already have?
I think that there's a few different ways that we can see this. We exist right now in a time when we can create online memorial pages. You can have a virtual funeral. People are even sending text messages after they've died.
Mm-hmm.
I
And
saw that article on
yeah,
TalkDeath, I think. Yeah.
yep, yeah, it's a real thing. And so it's interesting because this goes back to what we were talking about, where technology is being used to help immortalize someone. Just like how, you're trying to be how, ancient authors were trying to be immortalized in their books, which, Shakespeare was clearly immortalized, right? In his work. But what we're really seeing is that technology is trying to kind of go even further with, advancements in AI and other technologies. So we're using like technology basically to try to leave our mark and be remembered in a lot of ways, just like in those living memorial pages. That's really what that is for. Um, so yes, in some cases, it feels like this is part of a fear of maybe disappearing or not being remembered and trying to leave your mark. But to me, I think that a better way of looking at this, or another way of looking at it, is it's a way of continuing bonds with the dead. So I don't know if I would call
Yeah.
this death denial, but to me, it feels kind of like, as in a quick example, the Mexican tradition of El Dia de los Muertos, where
Mm-hmm.
every year they go to the cemetery, they build ofrendas, they welcome the dead with material objects, try to bring them back, and have a moment with them. It's all about honoring the dead and keeping up a relationship. And
Yeah.
so I think that we are just shifting in the way that we're doing that. And so continuing these relationships with the dead, it feels really death positive, to me in a way. And it also to me reflects the way that there's been a shift in the way we're talking about grief, because it,
Mm,
it used to be believed that being healed of grief means having a complete separation from the deceased person, like totally detached. You have a new life. They're,
mm,
a chapter
right.
behind you. But now we understand grief a lot differently, and grief is always there with you. And there's a theory or a concept called continued bonds, and it's part of the grieving process. And continued bonds basically means that you stay connected to the deceased in ways like going to their online memorial page, in, going to the cemetery, in looking at their old photos. And it's talking about how grief, it doesn't go away. And that's okay, because having that continued bond is a way to it be comforted. It really is a way to support someone when they're going through loss, to kind of go through this adjustment period. So there's that other extreme where we have that Black Mirror episode example.
I was just about to bring that up.
Exactly. So like, but then, it begs the question. So, for those that don't know, there's a woman who's
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I don't know.
okay. So there's a woman, her partner died very suddenly in a car crash. They were like totally in love. And her friend sent her this app saying that she can still talk to her partner. And what it did is that it used AI, and this is literally being built right now by actual companies, by the way.
Yes.
Where they're compiling your emails, your social media, your messages, your texts, and they create a digital AI version of you based on your quote unquote personality. And she is able to literally chat like live with the AI of her dead partner.
Okay.
And then it goes a step further where they essentially ship her like an avatar of him. And it's like super real looking, and she's able to talk to him and engage with him. And then it's really, I mean, I won't spoil it. You definitely should watch it, Danny. I'd recommend it. And you're able to see how complicated that becomes. And so that is like the extreme version of it. But to me, that and that's what we see in the show is it's her way of trying to deal with the grief, but it ends up kind of turning into the opposite type of scenario. So there's ways that I think we can take technology to the extreme, but I think at the end of the day, it's becoming just like a natural, quote unquote, natural evolution in the way that we are engaging with the dead, really based on the plain fact that our photos, our videos, our memories, they're all digital now, right? And that's how we communicate with each other.
Right.
Yeah. And another example of just that sort of future that Black Mirror is taking to the nth degree, just look at what we're doing with our respected famous individuals, dead movie stars, dead musicians, where we're creating the holographs, or we're having a digital representation of an actor portraying a character in a movie because they wanted to make a sequel, or they just felt they needed that character and they're making a digital version of the actor to play the role rather than recasting it, because we just can't let go of that particular person that, grabbed us at some point and made us really want that one person.
Right. It did, the initially that text message story reminded me of a story I saw on Imager where this person's dad had passed away. His dad liked to hide these miniature rubber ducks around the house and in like their cars and things. And after he died, his son was talking about how for years he was still finding these little rubber ducks like in different places, like hundreds of them hidden around the house. And that kind of reminded me of what you were talking about, Mandy, that ongoing relationship with someone who's died. And so these other technologies are just sort of a different way of doing that, which makes sense, right? Because technology is ubiquitous now. I think the difference maybe is just that the technology isn't necessarily neutral in that I wouldn't say Facebook is apolitical or amoral or an impartial tool, but I think
definitely not
that people can still use those systems and for something else, or make the bias explicit and sort of seek to subvert them without going off on too much of a tangent about capitalism. But so I think it's a different way of using that. And I really like what you said about continuing that relationship with the dead. I think that's really important. And I think that's a great way to look at it. And so many cultures have done that as well. Like I'm an atheist, but I do practice some form of paganism. And so in paganism, a lot of people on Samhain, around Halloween, they will honor and speak to the dead. So in that religion, that's just another form of continuing that relationship, right? So that's I think whatever form that takes, I think that's a really healthy way to view that process.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I don't know if you want to go into this, but with technology and what we call digital footprints, like there's so many challenges with that too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's it is, we're talking about digital, and the way that we talked about it just now is it seems like, oh, it's just the way things are going to be, but at the end of the day, there's a huge challenge with technology too, and using technology as a legacy tool, right? There's so much impermanence to digital technology. Technology is
Yeah.
changing so fast. I mean, just a quick example is one of our most recent clients, they were using an online memorial platform to memorialize people for their business. And the owner of the online memorial site died suddenly and had no succession plan, and just all their work just disappeared. They just took everything offline.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Wow.
and and that happens all the time. And we rightly so get these questions from our clients saying, what happens if your company gets sold, or you go out of business, or if I die, what's going to happen there? And so like we're having to build our own kind of succession plan, and what they call in cemeteries like an endowment fund, so that we can like keep the servers up if everything goes to shit, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and it's similar like on Facebook, like Facebook clearly knew that that was important, so they added the concept of the legacy contact. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. So you can add
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
someone as a legacy contact if you die, to take care of your account. There's so much politics around that, about who has access to what and who has your passwords.
Hmm.
But it's a whole new world that we need to be thinking about. And, it's basically like less than 20 years that everyone's really been on the internet, which is not a long time.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about part of that. Yeah, that business aspect of it. I do have a friend I have one friend who has a memorial account on Facebook, but I have another friend who didn't have anyone set up do that on their Facebook account. And what happened was I was looking at their account a couple weeks ago while I was thinking about this, and they've been tagged in, they'll have people come on their Facebook page and like write, hey, thinking about you, that kind of thing. But they also get tagged in like spam posts from either other accounts that got hacked or people who just don't realize that they died, maybe something like that. And it's really, it's kind of a mess. So that is, crazy to, like, for example, my wife has my my LastPass password and information about where like all our family videos are uploaded and that kind of stuff. But it's a lot. There's a lot going on there that you have to kind of juggle and think about if you want all that stuff taken care of if you die suddenly, which kind of gets into advanced directive and that kind of stuff as well, I guess.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that is something that like pre-planners are starting that are just really starting to do. When people are trying to encourage folks to pre-plan for their funeral, part of it is there's a whole digital section now. And there has to be. Just like it's not even like our social media, it's like our banking information, like everything is online now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And even the first I heard about the sort of idea that a business has to have plans in place for when the founder dies and stuff is even before technology. It was around the business opportunities that were quote unquote available within the cryonics industry, where people were spending, tens of thousands, $100,000 to preserve their bodies for some future time when they can be cured and live again. Needed the assurance that the company is not going to go under and that their body is not just going to be in a refrigerator that the power goes out and it thaws again. And there was definitely some discussions around that I was hearing probably in the 80s or maybe the early 90s. I don't remember exactly when. I remember I was relatively young, when all this cryonics kind of got a little bit of a fad thing and people were panicking about what happens if the company goes under.
It's still a thing. I went to
Oh, I know it's still a thing.
yeah, I went to a cryonics facility and they get the same questions, and it's, it's so expensive because they're building
Uh-huh.
these funds. And I mean, cryonics is super fascinating. What we talk about.
So here's something that I have thought a lot about, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. And it's that, and you actually brought it up earlier, but the sort of what keeps you from nihilism, I guess, the if you're going to die, why does anything matter? Or even just more generally, death anxiety. How do you keep focused on finding meaning and not getting bogged down in existential despair, so to speak?
It's a great question, and it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a question that I'm still working through in therapy. As someone who's had depression since I was like a teenager, it's always something that I've had to try to work on.
Mm.
And so it does definitely harp back to what we talked about feeling like you are making some kind of a difference. And so for me, I try to focus on the pieces that feel good. So playing music, playing shows, appreciating art, and the volunteer work that I do, and surrounding myself with cute dogs. Those are the
Mm.
pieces. It's like the little things to me that
Hmm.
that I'm able to use to kind of ground myself. But when it comes to the grind and money and everything, that all these constructs that we built, that's what I struggle with the most. And so that's where I try to balance it as much as possible, as I'm sure you both do, by trying to just make a living and then being able to take the time to appreciate and fall in love with things like art, music, and everything in goth culture.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Trey?
Um, I mean, I pretty much agree. I usually, as far as how I deal with concepts of death anxiety or concerns about my own death, or more importantly, the idea of, what's it all for? What's the point? Is I agree. I think about a lot of the small things. Like if I die, if I get in an accident and die on the way home from work, how's my cat gonna eat? And who's gonna take care of her? And, who's gonna help my mom with doing her own memorial pages, because she's in a whole process of going through her photo albums and putting together little stories and making this legacy book. And I do a lot of tech support on that as she's trying to deal with these online resources to put things together. And I'm, helping her to put them together. Like, who's going to do that? Stuff like that is the sort of things that I think about that keeps me moving forward if I start to despair about any sort of meaninglessness of life. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it. And it is all about those little things and the small connections you have with the people in your life.
Yeah. There's a story I heard the other day when I was doing some research. There's it's a Buddhist story, I think, about a man who was meditating in a cave with tattered clothes. His concern with death was so great that as he was meditating, his tattered clothes fell apart, but he decided not to mend them because he thought that if he were to die this evening, it would be wiser to meditate than to do useless sewing, which is essentially to illustrate like how an awareness of death refocuses what's important, which is kind of what we've been talking about, which for
I love
me
that.
is, kind of important for me, recognizing that if I am to die, why it's important to come to terms with my temporality and directing my actions towards making meaning, making my own meaning, because I don't think there is like a grand design. And so how can I reduce suffering right now and make life more bearable right now? Like if we were talking about that before, like if I making a sandwich for my son, right? That gives him a sense of stability. It builds a connection between us. Like that's a meaningful thing to do. It's a small act, but it's important. The thing that bothers me is I see these videos, usually on TikTok, but these videos where, and this kind of goes to like how our agency is kind of limited by oppressive system, but they'll interview like boomers or people in palliative care and ask, you know, what are your biggest regrets in life, or what advice would you give to people to avoid having regrets in life? And it's usually like, you know, spend more time with your family or your friends, follow your passions, that kind of thing, vacation more, work less, that kind of stuff. And so while for me, what I've been struggling with is, while I think it's useful to meditate on death and keep in mind what's important, I think sometimes we place too much of an emphasis on the personal responsibility side of that and don't recognize that systems exist which don't allow the luxury of time, where some people have to work multiple jobs to meet basic needs, or if you throw in a disability in the American healthcare system, or you know, I just saw a statistic the other day that said like 85% of autistic people are unable to keep a job. Right. So we know that the systems are ableist and racist and sexist and classist. And so it's a nice idea, but it's also important to remember that what were the broader power structures that we're working within. But without going too far down that road, I think for me, finding a deeper connection with the people around me has been really important as well, especially over the last couple of years, partly with the pandemic, but being isolated and trying to do everything myself and realizing how important it is to have a network of people, and how social connection is really core to my personally finding meaning. Because, you know, the sort of like the atheist line of not fearing death is, I wasn't conscious before I was born, and so it'll be the same after death. But for whatever reason, that sort of doesn't work for me, going from like existing to non-existence. That's never really helped ease that fear. So the way I kind of have been viewing it, and I just talked to my son about this the other day, was the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi talked about viewing death as a celebration, like a milestone, like we would celebrate a birthday or having a child or going to college, as part of this cycle of life, because it marks our time on earth. Again, going back to like the temporality, where if something is temporary, it imbues meaning into what we have while we have it. But the point that he was making was, if you are mourning a loved one, what you're mourning is the absence. You're mourning that you don't have that person anymore. So it can potentially be harmful to view death that way, sort of in a way that if a parent won't let a child move out of their house, because the point of having being a parent is to prepare the child with the tools they need to be able to move out, or to, I guess, to function in society. So if you won't let them do that, it's more of a selfish sort of way of viewing that relationship. And so there's that parallel of death being a fear of loneliness. And so changing that relationship or that perspective to seeing it as a celebration, because it is like the only thing, it's the most normal thing that anyone can experience, right? It is everything in the universe experiences death. So that's sort of where I have been trying to come at it and think about it, if that made any sense. My cold medicine is catching up with me now, so I feel like I'm rambling a lot, but yeah.
No, I mean, you made a lot of good points, and there's definitely so much we could talk about, you know, the whole privilege of being able like not to work and quote unquote enjoy your life more. Like there's so much there, and it's even so related to like what do we consider a good death? Like, just calling something a good death is like a huge form of privilege that we don't realize. But I think that, I feel like what you had mentioned is kind of in line with what Trey and I were saying with, taking those little things, those little moments and finding the meaning in that and the joy and the comfort in those, just like making your son a sandwich. I feel the same way when I, give my when I feed my dog dinner and I watch her eat
Mhm.
it. And I think that all of that is are the little things that we have to look at. And it's going back to the whole mindfulness piece. And it's something that I'm terrible at, but I'm really trying to get better at. But being more mindful of, just taking a moment, like smelling the smells, feeling something, just kind of feeling life in a way. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's really not, especially if you're in a position where the smells you're smelling are awful and things you can feel are gross, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So let's wrap up with a couple questions then, if that's okay with everybody.
Mhm.
And they're not necessarily related, but I did think they were important questions. So the first one is just something that I've struggled with, and I wanted to get your perspective on, Mandy, and see what your opinion was on this. But the question around how we should engage with people we know, friends who have lost someone, who have a family member or a friend who have died, and how we kind of what are some best practices to engage with them? Because I know I've struggled with knowing how to do that in the past, and I know I've seen, for example, on Facebook where their feed will be full of people engaging with them, and then they'll have a post about, this happened, uh, this person died, and then it'll just be, nobody will be interacting with them. So how can we better engage with someone who is mourning the death of someone close to them?
Definitely. I think a lot of it is just about being there. People are not comfortable with death, as you said, and so they feel awkward and they are scared of death themselves and they don't know how to engage with it. Some people don't want to engage with it because they think it's going to make them feel too sad or it's going to, trigger maybe a loss that they've gone through. But my advice is to be there, to embrace the awkwardness, to let go of any platitudes. And when we're talking about support, something that is not supportive is texting, let me know if you need anything. Like, no, someone is mourning a loss. Make your mac and cheese casserole and bring it to their house. Go run their errands for them. Go pick up grandma at the hospital. Go do those things that they have to do so that they know that someone is there and that they're feeling supported. And we often feel that we need to fill a room when it's silent with conversations, and that is something that it's hard not to do, but that's where embracing the awkwardness comes in. Just
Mhm.
being able to be there and sit with someone, and you don't have to talk. You don't have to talk about things. You can be um it's really just the act of like of being there and feeling comfortable with it and asking them about their loved one. So that's a big challenge that we see, is that because people don't want to like upset the person, they try to like avoid even saying the person's name. Saying the
Yeah.
person's name is so important. I loved it when Jack did this, oh my gosh, remember that time when Bill and I went to do this? Like, that's what you want to hear when you're grieving a loss. You want to hear those stories. You want to be constantly remembering and thinking, and maybe not constantly, but you want to be remembering and talking about that person. And so just by saying their name, sharing stories, and acknowledging that they died, and instead of, being like, oh, like when after that thing happened with, and like it's no, like, yeah, when Jack died, like you have to just be able to say those words because it's only going to make their experience more difficult if everyone is tiptoeing around them.
Right.
So that's really the advice I would give is to be there,
Hmm.
be present, and like actually do something actionable for that person that's helpful for them at that time.
Yeah. I think my fear in the past was if I couldn't say the perfect thing, then I shouldn't say anything because I thought, well, if I just say something that sounds kind of generic, then that's not helpful. It's just kind of noise. But I think the, especially if it's a friend, the absence of reaching out and saying anything is more painful than saying something that maybe is not, than saying something else. Saying something is better than not saying anything.
Because feeling like in that moment of grief, like you're already feeling so isolated in your feelings. And then like
Hmm.
people think like, oh no, like, they're grieving, they're in their own world, like I shouldn't be messaging them. It's like, yes, beyond the sort of what you have to do to plan a funeral and stuff, when you've just lost someone, like you're not really doing much. Like you're home and like you're not feeling good. And
Yeah.
just having like radio silence on your phone is not going to make any of
Right.
that
Right.
feel better, And like there's a reason why cultures have things like Shiva, where you're stuck for 7 days having every meal with a bunch of people and just being around people.
Hmm.
Um, and it sounds awful as someone who's definitely more of a someone who doesn't like to be around people a lot,
Hmm.
but there's a reason why we do it. And it's so helpful to the grief process. And, I had a friend who died suddenly really young, and they had a group of really tight-knit friends, and they all just ended up like camping out in one person's living room for 7 days and like
Hmm.
didn't move. And I was like, you guys sat Shiva. That's literally what you did. And being with people during those times, it's the best support that you could give someone.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. That's really beautiful. Yeah. All right. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask was something we haven't really talked about before, but I think is also very important. And it's I guess, sort of moving on from talking about other people's death to our own death or preparing for our own death. What sort of agency in our dying process looks like and what complications might arise. Uh, so I learned a lot watching the 2 live streams you have up on the YouTube channel, on the TalkDeath YouTube channel, about medical aid in dying. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about that or about advanced directives and sort of why those are important, what those are for, and why we should be thinking about those when it comes to end of life kind of stuff.
Definitely. So, for those who aren't aware, medical aid in dying is when someone is given a terminal diagnosis, which is considered, 6 months or less of being able to live. And I just also want to preface this by saying I'm not a nurse or a specialist in this. It's just something I do have some information on. And so, what you're able to do is you're able to essentially receive doctor's approval. It does have to go through a few doctors, depending on the state or province or country you're in. And it allows the patient to essentially request to die. Um, and again, this is really strictly generally for people who have a terminal diagnosis. And depends again where you are. In some areas, it's called, like in Canada, it's called physician assisted death because it's a physician who is generally giving you medication or injecting you medication that will kill you in a few minutes. And I think that giving people the option to be able to end their life when they know that they're at the end, when they know that their quality of life is going to be strictly diminished. And it's, it's so inevitable. Then I think that it's really powerful to give people the ability to do that. And, that is kind of generally what it is. But with it, though, there are complications and there is really an issue with access um, to this. Just like we can look at the hospice numbers and how people of color are much less likely to get hospice care. It's the same
Hmm.
thing when it comes to medically and dying. There are systemic barriers that are preventing BIPOC from being able to access this. Um, and there is, a very important disability-centered critique around this as well, in that, it disability rights activists talk about how it's going to further reduce their autonomy. And, folks with disability are often, always the first ones left behind, right? So that's something that's really important that I want us to, always acknowledge in these conversations. Um, but ultimately, when the laws are not in place properly and the systems are not set up properly, it's very similar to what's going on with the abortion laws right now. When there isn't
Yeah.
proper access, it just creates way more suffering and way more pain. And so giving people that autonomy is super important, but there's a lot more we have to do on the systemic side of like how we can make it accessible to all and how we can ensure that the vulnerable populations are not being uh, where it's not negatively impacting them as well.
Hmm.
Yeah. This was brought up in those videos, but I personally know a couple people. One of them was in my family who more or less had uh, died basically by morphine dose from at the end of their life, right? So it's kind of going to the access thing you were talking about, where that's kind of happening already, but in those cases it's not really the person making the decision. It's a nurse or a family member uh, upping the morphine dose until the person dies, which I
Which is
have heard
maybe
happens
what
a lot. But
yeah, and sometimes it's, the person does want that. And then, what we're seeing is when there is no accessibility or someone is like not deemed, you know, uh, available to have that treatment, um, a lot of people just stop eating and they refuse food. And so it
Hmm.
becomes a much longer, difficult, painful process for people when they don't have the right access. And on top of that, this is, super interesting but terrible thing that's come up recently. A good friend of mine, Jill Shock, she's Death Doula LA, as she's known on social media.
mhm.
She's a death doula in Los Angeles, obviously, and she does a lot of medical aid in dying. A lot of her clients, or she tends to be a person that folks will turn to when they make that decision. And there's an issue now just with the medication. And they used to, the ideal is that they would have this one pill and it had because these what you're given, it's a concoction of different medications to stop your heart, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. And now what's happening is doctors, like, they're not making these pills anymore because it's not commercially viable for pharmaceutical companies. So it's a bunch of different medication that they're literally crushing up, shaking into a bottle of juice. And if the person just doesn't have a couple um a couple morsels of the pill, it is taking people like hours to die. And it's supposed to be like a 20-minute thing. And so just that is challenging this, because no one wants to spend the money to produce these pills. And so just that is a huge challenge now that that no one is talking about with medical aid and dying, and it's becoming like a real problem for them.
I don't know if it's directly related to this, but I know I was reading some articles around some protections or some countries that were resisting exporting certain drugs because they were being used for, death penalty type things too. Not, euthanasia, not where the person's choosing to die, but because the law has determined the person needs to die and they're being given the concoction to kill them, on death row. And I don't know if that dovetails it all in with this, because those same medicines that can be used for palliative relief can also be used for retributive killing.
I'm actually not aware of that, but I'm sure it's all very well connected because a lot of it's the same drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I'm sure that goes back to the systems that are in place to benefit the people in power and disadvantage the people that don't have power, so it just depends on who's making the laws and who's paying the people that make the laws and all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I know one thing I learned, just thinking about end of life and how it can be, I think we all kind of hope that we're going to die in our sleep peacefully, but that's not necessarily how it goes, and it can be more complicated than that. And, when I saw a nurse on TikTok talking about how, people kind of think, well, initially they might think at least, do whatever you want or whatever you can to resuscitate me if I'm in a situation. But she used the example of if you're going to do chest compressions, for example, first of all, there's a low chance that it might revive you. But also, if you're an elderly person, for example, there's probably going to be a lot of physical trauma, like you might have broken ribs or severe bruising or that kind of thing. And so if you do survive, you might have a poorer quality of life afterwards. And so it's also kind of around this piece of just having the information and having the conversations ahead of time and thinking these things through and being able to make those decisions for yourself before you're in a situation where you might not be able to make those decisions, right? So,
and that's where advanced directives absolutely come in, and it's free to do. Download form online, and you can fill it out and you can notarize it. You can send it into your local hospital. It's super important to do, and I really recommend that people do it, especially those that are in more vulnerable situations. Even when it comes to pre-planning, folks in the trans community, it's so important for them to do that to ensure that their wishes are being carried through when they die. So, it's one thing that, and again, this is sort of part of death denial, if you're in your 30s, 40s, even 50s, oh, I'm fine. I'm not going to die anytime soon. I don't need to take care of this. Get hit by a car tomorrow. You never know what can happen. And so I really want to encourage people to be thinking ahead and just ensure that what you want is just known by someone you love and you trust.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Mandy. People can find you, they can find your online memorial platform at mykeeper.com, and they can head over to talkdeath.com or TalkDeath on social media for a full wealth of fantastic content about death and dying. So I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to us today and taking the time to come on the podcast. It really was wonderful to get to spend time with you.
Thanks so much for having me. You both left me with a lot to think about.
Yeah, it was great.
Mandy, thank you again so much for spending time with us. I really appreciated your unique perspective on this topic. I think the takeaway for me was the importance of meditating or contemplating death on a regular basis. that's sort of what this episode has become for me, this series, I suppose. This is now the 5th episode we've done on death, interviewing people that work in the death advocacy space. And my relationship and thinking on the subject has changed over that time. You know, specific to this episode, we have technology, right? We talked about Keeper, we have apps. I use apps for meditation sometimes. You don't necessarily need technology to contemplate death, right? I think that's obvious. A couple reminders for me that I utilize are the body. So first of all, there's something like 1 million cells on our body that die every second. And remembering that can serve as a meditation on death, and also serve as a meditation on how reliant and interconnected we are on each other and on organisms and our environment, sort of going back to the importance of what are my values, what are my ethics, how do I live in a way where those small moments are aligning with those values, right? Whether that's making vegan choices or planting native plants in my garden, or being considerate to my spouse, or taking a spider outside instead of killing it, right? And then also thinking about time and transience. Each moment to moment, is a kind of death, right? The moment that we had, even if you want to use this episode as a metric, that time when you started this episode, when we started this episode together, it's gone. It's a type of death. It's a type of liminality, a type of ephemerality, right? And so that can serve as a meditation on the nature of being and the nature of death as well, and working towards a easing of the fear of death. I think that's one of the things I really like about Taoism and absurdism, even though those are two very different philosophies, but they both seek to add a easing of that fear of death, and even perhaps an elimination of that death anxiety, because, you know, most people don't think about death as an essential part of their existence. It's something we think of obliquely or remotely. But if you're struggling with a sense of meaninglessness, absurdism would advocate that you fall in love with the absurdity of existence, as Camus would say. Embrace that you are alive and let that cumulatively add up to something special over time. I think these are some things that have worked for me. There are no quick fixes. As with meditation, it is a practice, right? It is a lifelong practice. There is no easy answer or quick fix. But I don't think death avoidance is an answer either. And as I started off the episode mentioning, while it will take time, there are millennia of thought and literature on dealing with mortality. And I think that can be helpful over time, working through and processing that reality. On a fun note, I'm including a couple links for Mandy's musical projects in the show notes. One of them is a doom metal band, which is just fantastic, dripping with atmosphere, slow, mournful, brutal guitar and visceral technical drumming and haunting vocals, kind of the music that you would want to hex your ex-boyfriend to. Absolutely love it. And then another project that's a sort of like punk band infused with like Riot Girl and some like surf rock influence, which, you know, if you know me, you know that I love punk music. It's just super fast, straight to your throat sort of punk rock. Super fun to listen to. So I'm going to throw both of those links down in the references section of the show notes. Definitely recommend checking those out. I think you would really enjoy those. But with that, I'm going to let Azzy of Obscura Undead take over and share some brand new music with us.
Welcome to another installment of All Goth Considered with Obscura Undead. I'm your host, Azzy, and today we'll be exploring 3 new singles and what the artists themselves have to say about them. So take a moment to freshen up your drink, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Our first tune this month is from Los Angeles-based goth / electro / darkwave / what does genre even mean anymore? Bedroom DIY duo Male Tears. Formed in 2020, they released their debut self-titled album in February 2021. And since then, they have released a ton of singles. One of their more recent ones, Dominate, is one that I've heard get a ton of club play. It's a little too harsh to be darkwave, too electronic to be goth rock, a lot of atmospheric, industrial elements. I never quite know what to make of Male Tears, but that's part of the reason why I find them so interesting. Let's hear from James about Dominate.
Hello, everybody. I'm James Edward from Male Tears, and I'm a very nice person. And right now I'm going to talk about the writing process and inspiration behind our song Dominate. For the most part, I think that the way that we write as a duo is that we absorb sounds and new music that we're not that familiar with. With the song Dominate in particular, a lot of the influence came from being in environments that were heavy on BDSM and just kind of like alternative, subversive sorts of scenes. You know, the kind of music there and the energy that this kind of environment has, it all culminated into a particular kind of aesthetic that we wanted for the production style and the overall theming of Dominate. Besides that as well, like we just were in places that were like these after party kind of events where it was a lot of people that looked amazing and looked fabulous. Lots of vinyl, black vinyl wear, lots of pleather and leather, spikes, chains, things that really kind of influenced us to try and make something for that environment. You know, we wanted to create a song that was just as kind of like dark and seductive and very stomping and like heavy and industrial inspired, very EBM inspired stuff. Something that wouldn't sound so out of place in those kind of scenarios. So that's really what we wanted to put out there with this song. And we hope that we've done a good job at it. I feel like we definitely see a lot of footage of our songs being played in those kind of parties. So that is a great kind of mission accomplished feeling we get. And I'll close this off by giving a shout out to DJ Azzy Bats and Cemetery Confessions. Love you both.
Dominate.
Who Saw Her Die is a goth post-punk duo from Lovell, Kentucky. They're another band who released their debut material back in 2021, and what I believe is their first full-length album, Grey Gardens, this past September. With sweeping and atmospheric goth guitars and bass forming a trance-like atmosphere under the guttural vocals, they've managed to drag forward a lot of the 90s goth sound elements that I absolutely adore. Their latest single, 30 Days, is a post-album release in honor of all things Halloween. Steven tells us more.
Brian had the idea to do 30 Days of Night, and as a story, it has a lot of elements that are really compelling. It kind of centers around being trapped, facing an overwhelming power, and I really wanted to explore that lyrically. Musically, Brian sent me a driving bass line that, went with a dance beat that we had started with, and it just kind of meshed together really well. I think when I write, every song starts out in my head as the best song we've ever done, but it rarely turns out that way. So when something comes together so well, it just really gives you the motivation to keep doing it.
breaking from the American focus music this month, I'm closing out with Mark E. Moon, a now 4-piece post-punk band from the Isle of Man. Formed in 2018 by Mark Sale and Phil Reynolds, they've since signed with Cold Transmission Records and made what I think, at least, is a huge impact with their 2019 debut, Refer, which really highlighted their highly melodic writing, which blends together darkwave, post-punk, goth rock, and synth pop in a way that is just lovely. Their latest single, Dark Love, is a more synth-based track than I expected, but no less fantastic. Let's hear about it from Mark.
Hi, this is Mark from Marky Moon. Our new single, Dark Love, just dropped September 16th. It's a dark synth pop number about the relationship between two consenting adults whose way of life and sexual practices are still to this day frowned upon by many, many people. Their love considered a dark and unwholesome perversion. The lyrics to this song attempt to normalize the feelings experienced by many, many couples and individuals, people whose morals are considered suspect by a small-minded, usually conservative section of society. Marky Moon have, for the upcoming album Pop Noir, taken a much more synth-based approach. This doesn't mean we're abandoning our darkwave roots. At heart, we still love to make gothic music. We're just packaging it, for one album, a bit differently. Watch out for the new album in the new year. And meanwhile, love eternally to everyone out there.
You can come make me drown, but before I go down, there's something I have to explain. In the back of my mind is a need to assign you a measure of pleasure and pain. I want to watch, I need to see. You as a primitive released. I know that you are unafraid, but still I need you to embrace the thrill of it all. I state, I confess, we've suffered too long without excess. I tell you to stay, do you feel debased? Your partners have long since ceased to give grace. You can come take my crown, but before you go down, there's something I want and I need. As the story unfolds, will you do as you're told and be silent if I intercede? I've lived a life that's out of bounds. Hid all my passions underground.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
All right, so this month I have a selection of albums to recommend. Unfortunately, it is a smaller selection of albums from the last couple months, I suppose. That's largely due to the chaos in my life, dealing with a variety of chronic illnesses, some new illnesses shared between myself and my spouse, some health issues with my son, some hospital visits, and similar issues. So my last couple months have been more chaotic than usual, which means I didn't get as much time as I would like to both listen to music and take the time to actually prepare thoughts on album reviews. But I did manage to pull together a few albums to recommend, and so I'm going to chat about those for you right now. The first of these is Chilean darkwave goth rock band Temple Solar. They actually sent me the single off their new EP, City. The single is called Bitter Love. They serve up a classic goth rock track in the vein of The Mission. If you're looking for more of a classic sound, then this is the single for you. There's a low chugging backbone and more melodic meandering guitar melody over the top, with an occasional western flair as well coming from the bass guitar. The lyrics are catchy, the vocals are more on the droney side of things. The rest of the EP follows similarly, with tracks like Dreaming having the heaviest Johnny Cash dark western kind of inspiration, which I tend to prefer because it sets the band apart from other similar bands a bit more. From France cometh the band Parking Dance with their album Gloom Parasite. And it's kind of a tidal wave of sound. You've got reverb-soaked guitar and vocals with a very keyboard synth-sounding percussion beat on a lot of the tracks, with the bass guitar up in the front. Some tracks are layer on layer of electronic noise. Some tracks feature a heavier guitar to give it a bit of bite. There's definitely comparisons to be made to bands like Drab Majesty and Winter Severity Index, but this album is much more of a sensory overload kind of experience. There's all kinds of distortion and effects happening, at least in the first half. The second half does start to spread itself out in the sense that tracks are slowed down and there's a more traditional shoegaze, darkwave kind of structure with less auditory overwhelm happening. There's a good variety of sound on the album, and it's an interesting take on that style of darkwave that's been popular in the clubs. So I think it's definitely worth checking out for that reason. Then we have the new single from Hertz Parasite called Alpha Tier 2.0. I'm sure I've mispronounced that. It's a band out of Germany, and while you can probably make some comparisons to American bands, this is sort of a song that's more associated with the German sound to me. And it's that heavy metal industrial marriage that has such a strong German lineage in my mind, with bands like Das Ich and Umbra et Imago, or even like Seelenzorn. And this band follows along in that tradition. It's a more cleaned up sound than the earlier 2000s boom for that kind of band, but you can still hear the DNA for that style in this track with the metal riffs and raw drums. The vocals are great. They're melodic and clear and powerful. It leans into that more metal side of things than the industrial sound, but if you've been missing that aspect of the scene from a decade or so ago, you'll definitely want to check this out. It sort of gave me that rush like when I got to see Stromkern at Cold Waves not that long ago. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, I haven't listened to this in 13 years, but wow, does it still slap, and does it stand out in a way that is completely different from the kind of music that I listen to now? The next band is Last Grasp, a band from Florida, and I think it's a band worth checking out. This is sort of a recommendation of their the singles that they have out rather than a single song. I mean, I'm gonna link their song "Kiss the Crucifix." It's a more of like slowed down post punk. Sometimes they have some like acoustic goth tracks, but the track "Kiss the Crucifix" are more of like a death rock track, where the vocalist even does kind of a Roz Williams sort of vocal. It's more of a lo-fi band that leans into ambiance and emotion on their tracks, which you know I'm a sucker for. They have a few singles and EPs out right now that are classic drum machine, bass, synth, and guitar, but they're all catchy and dancey in this grounded, almost dirge-like way that I quite enjoy. Leaving These Stones Unturned from Double Eyelid out of Toronto is a great track for autumn. I can absolutely imagine walking down the road through piles of rust-colored leaves as a breeze nips at the nape of my neck. It's moody and melancholic as hell. There's this lovely synthesized string section in the background that Ian sings over the top of with his voice just dripping with emotion. I really like Double Eyelid. I think they've got a pretty good range and always keep their music fresh and interesting, and I think this is definitely one of their better tracks as well, so I really recommend checking it out. Spirits of Leo is from New York, and their new album Gossamer Blue is pure dream pop heaven. Fans of Drab Madge, Be Still Your Heart. The Bandcamp page references early 4AD, which I think is fair. There's also a chill to the album in the way that I'd say Frozen Autumn also feels cold. But it very much has this blend of shoegaze and post-punk and dream pop that results in a very introspective, swirly, reverb kind of chamber of sound. The album does a good job of varying up the tracks enough to keep it interesting, but it isn't a genre you're going into if you are thinking you might find an album too repetitive. But it is a lush, beautiful album that feels like a clear, starry night that's just bitingly cold, where you can feel the emptiness of the space because no one is around, but also feel like the world is closing in as the snow on the ground eats up the sound around you, creating this loneliness and longing on a cold, late-night walk. The next album is called Sleepwalker from the band Midnight Passage out of Russia. It's a post-punk album, and it is sexy as hell. The album makes me feel like I should be walking down the streets of New York at night with a mullet and sunglasses and trench coat in the mid-'80s. Like it feels like that kind of cool as hell. The band reminds me of acts like Grey Gallows or Agnes Circle. There's a minimalist appeal to the band. The synth and the bass all complement each other, but it feels like everything is given space, like a wide rolling cemetery. You get some bass lines that harken back to the Sisters, some synth that's reminiscent of newer acts like Rendezvous. And it's taken at a leisurely pace, so the morose and spacious vocals have room to breathe and echo off the inside of your skull. It's not anything novel, but for what it is going for, it's a perfect album. I loved everything about it, and I think it's just perfect for the fall season. Next up is Eternal 2, the album by The Blood Pact, and this is an album just for me. It's dramatic and dark. It's on the lo-fi side of things, but that's okay. It feels like the band takes some inspiration from dungeon synth, but the spirit of the album almost reminds me of early Japanese gothic metal bands like Malice Miser or Blood, but in a much less over-the-top way. And it's not a cacophony. It's much more subdued and controlled, but you get that feeling like from a cult 80s horror film. And I really like that gritty DIY kind of feeling to music when it fits the tone and aesthetic of the sound. When it's like evoking back alleys and dingy clubs, that kind of reel-to-reel feeling with obviously synthetic drum machines and synth bringing out that emotion of the music. So it might not be for everyone, but when we have a whole glut of bands now with super high-end production and sharp 21st century sounding synths and that kind of thing, this type of band fills in a gap in my soul, I think. This next album was also sent to me by a friend of mine. This is the band Silence Embrace. The album is called Meta Queer Dollies. This is kind of my off-the-wall industrial pick. The band is out of Ohio. And the album is straight out of the 90s. I mean, I fully feel like I should be in the car on the way to Blockbuster to rent the new Hellraiser sequel or something like that. The synths and electronics are layered nicely without being too muddied or complex, and there's plenty of samples throughout. The vocals are heavily modified in a way that gives this Ghost in the Machine quality, as if you're being haunted by specters of cyberspace, and now they're crawling through your wires. For one or two of the tracks, I think the emphasis on the 90s electronics doesn't work for me personally, just from an aesthetic perspective. Sort of like, just like feeling dated. But I think that's also like a really personal preference. And I'm sure for other people, that same sound is going to be completely nostalgic or even like subversive in an interesting way. For someone in a different context with a different life experience. It kind of brings to mind for me, and I'm not super familiar with this kind of music, but it reminds me of like Skinny Puppy or something like that. So it's a pretty sick album. It feels like it should have been the soundtrack to like a fucked up version of the movie Hackers or something like that. Next up is for swoopy post-punk and cold wave fans. It's the band Dunkelwald and the album Valdrach, which I'm sure, again, I've said wrong. This is a band out of Spain, and they deliver a passionate and dancey album that at times sits with you in the quiet moments of life, and at other times reaches for bombastic heights. You know what to expect going in, but there are a few surprises, like some 90s rave-inspired tracks and a dark electronic track to keep you on your toes. It's a solid album that stretches the width of the genre, so most of us will find something to love on the album. Now from post-punk cold wave to post-punk and dark wave out of Scotland, we have Glasshouse with their album Glasshouse. It gives off the feeling of dance floor lights in a smoky club for me. Some tracks feel like they take inspiration from Italo disco, so you're getting more of an upbeat album geared towards dancing rather than moping. There's a very 80s sound to the synth work on most of these tracks while still maintaining a razor-sharp production value. Some tracks feature gorgeous, lush femme vocals, and some tracks have a masculine vocal that's a bit more flat, with almost a nasal flair to it, which adds a whole different dynamic to the songs. But I think it remains diverse enough. Some tracks, like the title track, do sound much more like a modern darkwave track, but I personally more enjoyed the more anachronistic sounding songs on the album. Still, I think it's all killer and no filler. Next up, out of Boston, is friends of the show Pilgrims of Yearning with their new EP Hadal. Absolutely gorgeous album soaked in atmosphere. It's music for a full moon. The layering of these tracks are superb. There's so much going on, but everything is complementary without being overwhelming. The bass guitar I especially love because it has its own unique flavor. It's spicy in an interesting way. The synth effects are fantastic as well. The song Tides has all these 80s era sound effects that are just... they reach inside me and touch something I didn't know was there. Some might call it the G-spot. I wouldn't be that crass. Of course not. But there's a great variety of synth effects from track to track. The post-punk guitar work is incredible. Jules' voice is that of a siren's call, and Claudio even performs backup vocals here and there, which are delightful. It's a superb album that had me dancing through all 4 tracks, even though I have this nasty cold. Absolutely in love with it. Definitely go check it out. And then finally we have the album New Spring by the band Sectarian Bloom out of Oakland, California. And it's a very Oakland-sounding post-punk band, if that makes sense. You've got bass guitar, drums, and vocals. There's a lot of space between the instruments that gives this feeling of minimalism, in a sense. The album starts with more of a standard post-punk kind of feel, with that Oakland flair, and gets a bit more varied as we get further in with some post-punk breakdowns that I really enjoy. They play around with tempo as well, that I think works successfully. The vocals are flat and monotonous, which adds to that drone kind of feel. But this is a rule made to be broken, right? There's still plenty of melody, but there's always a hypnotic drone sort of backbone through the tracks, which give it almost a dreamlike feel. There's primarily a masculine vocal, but a feminine vocal shows up for backing vocals at different points in the album. Overall, great, stripped down, minimal, almost garage rock sort of sound in that kind of like down and dirty sort of post-punk way. And that's it for Sinister Suggestions. So thank you for hanging out with us. I saved for the end the stereotypical podcaster line of apologizing for my voice, for my vocal performance. As you can tell, I have a cold, or maybe you couldn't tell. So I've been quite nasally through this entire episode. Unfortunately, we had to kind of record this at the end of the month, which is why this episode is coming out late. And there was no way of getting around what my vocal cords and mucosal inflammation is doing to the sound of my voice. So thank you for bearing with me. As always, thank you to everyone on Patreon who has been supporting us throughout this year, throughout the 7, almost 8 years of the podcast. Of course, the Patreon hasn't existed for that long. That was something we started later on, but that's not important. Thank you all so much for your support. Literally, the podcast would have, I know I kind of mentioned this before this segment, the podcast would have shut down this year if it was not for Patreon. I posted a little more detail about this on Patreon, about sort of life happenings. I won't go into this on the podcast. I don't necessarily think that's the place for it. But you are truly the stars of the show here. So thank you so much for your support. Next month, we're going to be returning with one of our classic book review episodes. Last year, we talked about Italian Goth. This year, we're going to be reviewing the book Goth Music from Sound to Subculture by Isabella Van Elfren and Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock. The book purports to analyze goth culture through the lens of musicology and social theory in order to create a framework through which to understand how the vastly heterogeneous genre classifications that fall under the goth umbrella, quite controversially within this book, that includes things such as goth rock, death rock, dark wave, cold wave, cyber goth, gothic metal, future pop, synth pop, industrial, electro, neo folk, so on and so forth. How these disparate sounds, if goth is a music-based subculture, which they do stipulate, how can they therefore build a cohesive, consistently distinctive social subculture? It's a really interesting book, which varies wildly with things I find, with things I agree with and disagree with. So I think it's going to be quite a fun episode to wade through. And I hope you will return to join us for that exhumation, to borrow a phrase from the funeral industry that is appropriate to this episode and probably just tangential to what I'm actually trying to communicate here. I got to go take some more cold medicine. So thank you for spending your time with us. I truly hope this was as wonderful for you as it was for me, and that we all kind of learned something and grew together. So thank you again, and until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.